During a low-speed car crash in Georgia, what should have been a routine airbag deployment turned into a life-altering injury for Hannah Oliver. The collision occurred at roughly 25 miles per hour, but when the airbag deployed, it shattered the designer glasses she was wearing, driving fragments into her eye. Doctors later determined the damage was irreversible and Hannah went blind in that eye. But in the aftermath, she channeled the trauma into action, later launching a shatter-resistant sunglasses brand to prevent the same injury from happening to others. A young Arkansas couple pleaded guilty after attempting to sell their 2-month-old baby at a campground for $1,000 and a 6-pack of beer. The deal was written out in a handwritten contract and witnessed by others, one of whom alerted police. Authorities recovered the infant and charged the parents with child endangerment and attempting to accept compensation for adoption. The father was sentenced to prison time while the mother received probation, and both were permanently barred from contact with the child, who was placed in protective care. This was the horrifying moment a young child was nearly killed by her bus driver when she became trapped after her backpack was caught in the closing door of a Kentucky school bus as she was getting off. The driver then pulled away without noticing, dragging the child alongside the moving bus for hundreds of feet. Luckily, honking bystanders eventually caught the bus driver's attention and she was forced to come to an abrupt stop. The girl suffered serious physical injuries including nerve damage, requiring nearly a dozen surgeries and skin grafts, along with lasting psychological trauma. Court filings noted that she was a special needs student and argued that the bus route, supervision, and safety procedures in place were not appropriate for her needs. The bus driver was removed from duty and later fired, and the school district acknowledged failures in safety oversight. Years later, the child, publicly identified as Allie Rednauer, is back on her feet but continues to deal with ongoing physical and emotional effects and continued medical care. The case ultimately ended with a nearly $5 million settlement, and Allie and her family have since spoken out, pushing for mandatory school bus safety upgrades and warning that without changes, another child could be seriously injured or killed in the same way. This is the face of 87-year-old World War II veteran and daylily horticulturist Leo Sharp, who was pulled over in Michigan in 2011 after appearing confused and disoriented. A search of his vehicle uncovered more than 400 pounds of cocaine, revealing that he'd secretly spent years working as a high-level courier for Mexico's Sinaloa cartel. Because he looked so harmless and was rarely questioned, Sharp transported massive quantities of cocaine across the U.S. before being caught. He later pleaded guilty to drug trafficking charges and was sentenced to prison in his late 80s, becoming one of the oldest cartel mules ever prosecuted. In 1951, the French town of Pont-Saint-Esprit was hit by a sudden outbreak of severe illness after residents ate bread from a local bakery. Around 250 people experienced intense hallucinations, convulsions, and severe paranoia, with some reporting visions of snakes crawling out of their bodies or being consumed by flames. Several victims jumped from windows or ran screaming through the streets, while others were restrained or sedated as hospitals quickly filled beyond capacity. At least 5 people died and dozens were committed to psychiatric institutions. Investigators later concluded the outbreak was most likely caused by ergot poisoning, a toxic fungus that can contaminate rye and produce effects similar to LSD, which many historians have also theorized may have contributed to the Salem witch trials. During the 2021 Kabylia wildfires in Algeria, Ben Ismail, a 38-year-old musician who had traveled hundreds of miles to volunteer to help, was falsely accused by locals of starting the fires. Police initially sheltered him inside a station, but a crowd broke in, dragged him into the street, and killed him in a frenzy of violence before setting his body on fire. The killing was filmed and spread online, allowing authorities to later identify dozens involved. In 2022, 49 people were sentenced to death and others to prison terms for their roles in the senseless attack. On March 1, 2026, a shooting occurred inside Baptist Health Brookwood Hospital shortly after 24-year-old Precious Johnson had given birth to her first child. Police said Johnson had delivered a healthy baby just minutes earlier when around 9:30 p.m., her 19-year-old husband, Kenneth Terry Jr., pulled out a handgun he had brought into the hospital room and fatally shot her before turning the gun on himself. Both were pronounced dead at the scene, while the newborn baby survived and was not reported injured. The hospital immediately went into lockdown, as officers secured the maternity floor and confirmed there was no ongoing threat. Family members later said the couple had been experiencing serious relationship problems in the weeks leading up to the birth, including disputes over which relatives would be present at the hospital. This was the moment an idiot tried crossing train tracks with his bike just seconds before a train came roaring through. As the crossing lights flashed, he suddenly tripped and fell directly onto the tracks in the path of the oncoming train. But he managed to grab his bike and escape just moments before the train came flying past him. He managed to escape literally a half a second before the several hundred-ton locomotive would have almost certainly turned him into human paste upon impact. Speaking of idiots, this man just narrowly avoided being sliced in half by a circular saw. He was apparently cutting into wall tile when he suddenly slipped, causing him to fall directly on top of it. Somehow, the saw barely missed his stomach and torso, as he even had to lift his shirt to make sure his intestines were still inside his body. This was the moment a family hanging out in their driveway suddenly realized they weren't alone when a massive black bear casually pulled up behind them. Ring camera footage captured the exact second one of the kids spotted the animal and softly yelled "bear" before immediately abandoning the rest of the family to save himself first. Within seconds, everyone ran to the door while the bear continued minding his own business. Although black bears are usually shy and avoid humans, they can become extremely dangerous if cornered, startled, or provoked, especially around food or cubs. This was the terrifying moment a driver realized he was about to be carjacked. He turns down a narrow street at night and is immediately met by a group of men waving weapons that look like machetes. But instead of backing out, he moves forward, only to realize the road has been deliberately blocked. Two large tanker trucks are positioned on the street, and a fallen tree is laid out between them, leaving almost no way through. Within seconds, the men rush the car and start smashing the windows, trying to force their way inside. The driver panics but stays moving, squeezing the car through a tight gap along the side of the road, barely clearing the obstacles as the attackers were closing in. He manages to break past them and speed off before they can get the doors open. Incidents like this are a known tactic across parts of the world where organized roadside robberies happen frequently, with criminals blocking roads to trap drivers before surrounding the vehicle. It's not clear where this particular clip took place, but the setup matches methods that have been commonly reported across the globe. I got nothing else to say. What are you still doing here? Get out of here. In 2017, in Ottawa, Canada, model Kat Gallagher underwent a sclera tattoo, a rare and controversial procedure where ink is injected directly into the white of the eye. The person performing it reportedly used far too much ink and improper technique, causing purple dye to leak from her eye and triggering a serious infection. Despite emergency treatment and months of complications, she was left with permanent vision damage and a dangerously thin sclera, putting her at risk of losing the eye entirely. She later revealed the pain was excruciatingly constant, with fluid continuing to seep from her eye for several weeks, and has since spoken out to warn others about the risks of unregulated body modifications. In 2012 in Wisconsin, Dale Decker suffered a slipped disc that triggered a rare neurological condition known as persistent genital arousal disorder. The disorder caused him to experience dozens, sometimes over 100, involuntary orgasms a day without any stimulation, often striking in public or at inappropriate moments. He later said the episodes took over his life, disrupting his ability to work, maintain relationships, and even grieve properly, with attacks occurring during critical moments, including his own father's funeral. In June of 2023, in the North Atlantic Ocean near the Titanic wreck site, Pakistani businessman Shahzada Dawood and his 19-year-old son Sulman were among those killed when the Titan submersible suddenly imploded. Nearly 9 months later, after recovery efforts at extreme depths, small amounts of human remains were returned to the family. Identified through DNA testing, the material was described by Shahzada's wife as the slush that was left delivered in 2 small shoeboxes. Due to the conditions of the implosion in the environment, the remains were limited and heavily fragmented, with some of the recovered material being mixed together, meaning it could not be definitively attributed to one specific individual. In Rochester, New York in 2022, a woman installed a hidden trail cam at her mother's grave after noticing it kept being disturbed. The footage soon captured her father, the woman's ex-husband, returning to the cemetery and urinating directly on the grave multiple times per week. The behavior had been going on for at least several months, and likely closer to a year or more before it was caught on camera. In multiple clips, his partner could be seen waiting nearby in a car while he carried out the act. Police were contacted, but the case fell into a gray area legally, with any charges depending on local cemetery regulations. The situation drew attention for the sustained, deliberate nature of the acts, targeting the grave long after the relationship had ended. This may be the most disturbing Valentine's Day gift of all time. South African trophy hunter Marilies van der Merwe drew backlash after killing a 17-year-old bull giraffe during a Valentine's Day hunt her husband reportedly paid for. After shooting the animal, she cut out its heart and presented it to her husband as a Valentine's Day gift, later posting photos with it online. The images quickly went viral and sparked criticism worldwide, but she defended the hunt by saying regulated trophy hunts generate permit fees that go toward wildlife management, anti-poaching efforts, and local land conservation, and that older, non-breeding animals are often selected to reduce pressure on habitats. In 2020, a Dollar General employee with diabetes was fired after drinking a $2 orange juice at the register when she began feeling symptoms of diabetic shock. The company said she violated policy by consuming merchandise before paying for it, labeling the act as grazing even though she later paid for the drink. The dispute escalated into a lawsuit, and a jury ultimately awarded her $277,000 in damages, turning the incident into a widely discussed example of strict workplace policy clashing with a medical emergency. This was the moment drivers on a highway in San Antonio, Texas, realized something was seriously wrong with the man behind a drifting SUV. Recognizing a medical emergency, 29-year-old Rene Valerio Albi pulled his truck in front of the SUV and gradually slowed down, allowing the runaway vehicle to bump into his bumper until both eventually came to a stop. The driver had suffered a heart attack, and a nurse who stopped at the scene began administering CPR, helping to revive him until paramedics arrived. Doctors said he's expected to make a full recovery thanks to the quick actions of a few strangers. Here's an insane clip of a man narrowly avoiding a horrific death by elevator. Commenters pointed out that he's lucky enough he didn't get crushed, but he also could have easily fallen down the shaft once the elevator moved. Here's a horrifying scene as tourists desperately flee an erupting Mount Etna in Sicily as thick plumes of ash and smoke rise behind them. Mount Etna is Europe's most active volcano and one of the most active in the world, erupting frequently as magma constantly pushes toward the surface beneath the mountain. Despite its constant activity, most eruptions involve slow-moving ash plumes that give people enough time to evacuate. Deaths from this volcano are extremely rare in modern times, though hikers and tourists have occasionally been injured after getting too close to active craters. Amu Haji, an Iranian hermit dubbed the dirtiest man in the world, avoided bathing for nearly 60 years because he believed cleanliness would make him sick. He lived this way into his 90s, smoking animal dung, eating roadkill, sleeping on the ground, and rarely interacting with others. Then in 2022, villagers finally convinced him to bathe for the first time in decades. Just a few weeks afterward, Haji fell severely ill and died at age 94. Matthew Day Merritt was born without legs and learned to walk on his hands from early childhood. As a young boy, his small size and unusual movements led filmmakers to place him inside the E.T. suit for the movie, where his hand walking gave the alien its unsettling, otherworldly motion. In October of 2018, 53-year-old Allison Gibson became trapped in her own bathtub after sitting down to bathe and realizing she could no longer reach the grab bar she would normally pull herself up with. Alone in her home, she remained stuck for 5 days, surviving without food by drinking water directly from the tap. As time passed, she weakened and struggled with exhaustion, alternating the water between hot and cold to stay conscious and hydrated. From October 15th to the 19th, no one noticed she was missing until a mail carrier saw her mail piling up and alerted neighbors. Police were called and she was finally rescued, having narrowly avoided death from dehydration, hypothermia, or exhaustion after nearly a week immobilized in her own bathtub. In 2023, an 18-year-old mother from Miami named Jasmine Paez was arrested after trying to hire a hitman to kill her 3-year-old son using a parody website called Rent a Hitman. Police say she filled out an online request form, uploaded a photo of her child, provided her address, and asked that the job be completed by the end of the week. In the message, she wrote that she wanted to get something done once and for all, and requested that her son be taken far, far away and possibly be killed. When investigators asked why she wanted her own son dead, Paez gave no real motive, only that she was overwhelmed and no longer wanted the responsibility of being a mother. The website's owner originally created Rent a Hitman as a joke, but after receiving hundreds of murder-for-hire requests over the years leading to multiple arrests, he now works closely with law enforcement and immediately reported Paez's request. Undercover officers posed as a hitman and arranged a meeting, where Paez allegedly confirmed she wanted the child dead. She was arrested and charged with solicitation to commit murder, and the boy was placed into protective custody unharmed. Scientists have captured the oldest living vertebrate on Earth drifting through near black Arctic waters, a Greenland shark moving slowly through the depths. Clear footage of these sharks is extremely uncommon because they live so deep and in low light. Scientists believe some can live for centuries, with eye lens analysis suggesting lifespans up to 400 years and possibly even closer to 500. They only grow about a centimeter per year, yet can still reach lengths over 20 feet, and females may not reach sexual maturity until around 150 years old, one of the slowest life cycles ever recorded. Many carry parasites that eventually damage their vision, yet they still hunt using scent and vibration. If the highest estimates are correct, this animal could have been alive since the 1500s, moving through the ocean long before the Pilgrims sailed to America. Here's some footage from an actual other world, captured by a robotic rover crawling across the surface of Mars nearly 225 million miles from Earth. What you're seeing isn't a traditional video recording. It's a splicing of thousands of individual photos stitched together into a moving panorama, since rovers don't record footage the way cameras on Earth do. Every frame has to survive extreme cold, radiation, and dust before being sent back as radio signals traveling through space. You're looking at terrain no human has ever touched, ancient rock formations and dry landscapes that may have once held water, captured piece by a machine made by humans exploring a silent planet. Dacre Montgomery has been open about being raised by what he described as an abusive father. He said he grew up terrified 24/7, was routinely screamed at, and had his self-esteem destroyed before he was even a teenager. By 18, he was struggling with severe depression and body image issues, and he said he still deals with trauma responses from that period of his life. Matthew Modine has said he watched a man die in front of him as a boy, a cyclist who was fatally struck by a car just feet from him. He remembers seeing the man thrown into the air and lying lifeless in the road, and has said it haunted him for many years. Shannon Purser, aka Barb, has spoken about being hospitalized for OCD so severe she was terrified to leave her own home. She described waking up with daily panic attacks, fear of contamination, and self-harm intrusive thoughts until she finally received treatment. Eduardo Franco has openly talked about growing up in a dangerous neighborhood in Yuma, Arizona, where he and his family lived under constant threat from local gangs. In interviews, he said his house was shot at multiple times in drive-by shootings, to the point where his family eventually relocated because the violence became impossible to live around. Why didn't they bring him back? Why didn't they bring him back? In March of 1998, 13-year-old Tristan Brubach left school in Frankfurt complaining of a backache and walked through the Liederbach pedestrian tunnel, a dim underpass children commonly used as a shortcut. While inside the tunnel, he was attacked and murdered in an extremely brutal assault. Investigators determined that the killer cut his throat so deeply that the wound reached his spine and nearly severed his head. After the killing, the attacker mutilated the body, removing Tristan's privates and taking them from the scene. Blood evidence suggested the killer remained in the tunnel for some time, staging the body and possibly washing himself in the nearby stream. Shortly after the murder, a man called police and calmly confessed, providing details only the killer would know. But when officers rushed to the tunnel, the caller had already disappeared. Despite decades of investigation, DNA analysis, and multiple suspects, Tristan's killer has never been identified. The Liederbach tunnel where the murder occurred was sealed off later that year and has remained closed ever since. Christopher John Sulos was a kind 37-year-old man with intellectual disabilities including autism who worked as a beloved greeter at a Chick-fil-A in Charlotte, North Carolina. But one day in September of 2024, a customer said there was an emergency and asked to borrow his phone. Instead, they stole it from him and used it to try transferring money from his account. They then began sending harassing messages to him and his family, falsely accusing him of being a pervert and other serious sexual misconduct. The perpetrator soon threatened to spread these accusations to his employer and the public unless a ransom was paid. The relentless harassment and fear of public humiliation caused Sulos severe emotional distress. Believing he had genuinely done something wrong, he tragically took his own life just a few days later. His family and federal investigators linked the cyberstalking, extortion, and false accusations directly to his death. The people responsible were later convicted and sentenced to 27 and 41 months in prison. In 1995, in Knoxville, Tennessee, 18-year-old Krista Pike lured 19-year-old Colleen Slemmer to a secluded area on a Job Corps campus where she spent 30 to 40 minutes torturing her. Slemmer was beaten, slashed repeatedly, and had a pentagram carved into her chest while she screamed and begged for her life before Pike ultimately crushed her skull with a chunk of asphalt. Afterward, Pike removed a piece of Slemmer's skull and kept it as a souvenir. Pike was later sentenced to death and remains the only woman on Tennessee's death row. Decades later, Slemmer's mother is still fighting to have the skull fragment returned for a proper burial, but Tennessee officials continue to hold it as evidence due to Pike's ongoing appeals and active death row status. Jim Carrey's family lost their home when he was just a teenager, forcing them to live out of a van while he worked overnight janitor shifts after school to help keep them afloat financially. The stress of that period led him to start performing stand-up at a young age, using comedy as a way to cope with instability and support his family, often bombing hard early on before eventually developing his stage presence. But after becoming one of the highest paid actors in Hollywood, he developed severe depression that he later said had been building for years beneath the surface of his success. He's spoken openly about relying on medication during that time, but eventually stepped away from it and began focusing on understanding the root of what he was experiencing rather than just masking the symptoms. Instead of keeping those struggles private, he described depression in interviews as a form of exhaustion from maintaining a version of yourself that doesn't align with reality, helping people better understand what it can feel like internally. He's consistently used interviews, speeches, and even his own artwork to talk about mental health, identity, and emotional burnout, often encouraging people to confront those issues directly and not define themselves solely by external success. Later in his career, Jim shifted away from constant mainstream roles and focused more on personal expression and selective projects, openly prioritizing his mental state over maintaining the level of fame he had achieved earlier in his career.